Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Owais Anwar. We've all witnessed the apocalyptic scenes coming out of Iran with the oil refineries and oil infrastructure being hit. We've also seen nuclear facilities being directly targeted despite specific prohibitions under international law. This conflict seems hell-bent on violating every taboo that we have under the international legal scheme. While the human impact is severe, no doubt, today I want to discuss the environmental impact of this war and what the weaponization of natural resources like water and oil means for the future of the region. To discuss this, I'm joined by Maham Naveed, who is the former chair of international law at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Thank you so much for joining us, Maham.
Thank you, Wes, for having me.
Maham, I wanted to start by discussing how the many ugly turns that this conflict, Iran, US, and Israel, how it's really shaped up, and much of the much of the critique, but also much of the concern internationally is around the environmental aspects of some of these things. These are not just Iran, but a number of the Gulf countries. We've seen attacks on oil infrastructure. We've seen massive emissions because of that. Not only the human cost, but also the environmental cost of these things. Could you give us some idea of what international law says about the environmental impact of warfare like that?
So I completely agree with you, Wes, that the current conflict is a massive blow to the international legal order, right? And as we've seen, this kind of like a pattern developing in the past couple of years with states like completely disregarding international law. And in this, I feel like in this landscape, international environmental law and resource law generally has become a casualty of this situation. So right now the conflict in the Middle East is becoming increasingly ugly from a legal perspective. We're seeing a pattern of attacks that don't just hit military targets, which is allowed under international humanitarian law, but the attacks have targeted infrastructure that civilians rely on to survive. And international humanitarian law is pretty straightforward on the fact that civilian infrastructure that is there to support basic human rights needs to be protected, and there are very few exceptions to that. So when we talk about exceptions, like the military objective exceptions is there, but it has a very strict a two-pronged test that has to be fulfilled if you're going to target a military target an infrastructure facility because it's a military objective, and the test includes what's the nature, the procedure, the proportionality test in international environmental law and international humanitarian law. But when it comes to an environmental perspective, the law is equally clear. So particularly Article 55 of the Additional Protocol 1 states that parties must protect the natural environment. And so in doing this, they're prohibited from methods of warfare that are expected to cause widespread and long-term severe damage, right? And these are the words. So it uses the word widespread, it uses the word long-term and severe damage, which kind of lays the groundwork for the proportionality test that comes into play. So the current attacks on energy infrastructure risk causing devastating civilian harm, including toxic pollution, acid rain, fires, and long-term health and environmental consequences. There are conversations that these may permanently damage the environment to an extent that the environment will not go back to the self-sustaining nature that it was prior to the conflict. And so this I feel like the current attacks significantly fall short on the proportionality test. Also, beyond that, customary international law reinforces the protection of environment on multiple occasions, right? And the prohibition of the destruction of natural resources is very, very strictly monitored. It's allowed, again, in the military objective exception, but otherwise there's a strong bar to it. I feel like also with the extent of environmental litigation that we've seen in the past year, that at the American Court of Human Rights, at the European Court of Human Rights, at the International Court of Justice, the environment is not just like an ancillary issue anymore in international law. It is like front and center of every test, like proportionality test, like the objectivity test, and the protection of the environment is front and center to it. So currently the attacks right now are completely out of proportion with regards to international environmental law.
No, absolutely. And Maham, what we're seeing is, a clear understanding that there is going to be this environmental harm, and yet those attacks keep on occurring. And I think in particular, one of the more egregious violators here is Israel, because we've seen Israel again and again repeatedly target, like for example, the oil refinery outside of to the north of Tehran. We saw the impact. I mean, it was apocalyptic, right? That's the words that were being used. The type of acid rain and the type of impact it had, not only on the civilian population there, but also on the environment throughout the region. Do we have any mechanism to hold people accountable, really, for such forms of violence?
I feel like mechanism, and as we've discussed on multiple occasions, is the shortcoming, right? And mechanisms, even though they are there, the enforceability and just the sovereign exception of voluntary jurisdiction in international law, like you cannot, for people who haven't done international law, you just cannot force a state to go before a court or a mechanism or a tribunal, and they're always like
much to everyone's frustration.
Much to everyone's frustration. And and then that is also coupled on with the fact that the enforcement mechanism, I think, with international environmental law, a lot of environmental law and water law and most resource law is like soft law. So soft law means that it is still in the developing stages, and the enforcement mechanisms are not as strong as they are. I feel like the strongest environmental enforcement mechanism that we have seen are in voluntary arbitration clauses, but like voluntary is the underlying fact. And we've generally just seen them in like investment disputes. We haven't really seen them for in large state-to-state cases. I think the transboundary harm concept, which the ICJ has elaborated upon, is becoming like front and center of the issue, and international water law and environmental law, and the UN Water Courses Convention, and similarly the Paris Agreement. A couple of others do talk about transboundary harm, but the issue remains that when it comes to the enforcement mechanism and when it comes to liability, there are reservations of a lot of countries with regards to the dispute mechanism clause, right? And that's where we stand. I think the largest movement with regards to environmental litigation was the climate change advisory opinion by the ICJ last year in July. But again, that was an advisory opinion that was taken to the ICJ by the General Assembly. So, and that also took a huge momentum on part of the Pacific Islands to be like, we're literally sinking, we're dying, or people have no place to go. So that is the threshold. I do feel like one strong enforcement mechanism, and I have always advocated for that, are human rights approaches towards environmental and water governance, right? So you take it into the human rights realm. The right to a clean environment, the right to human rights is not just in international law, it's enshrined in most of the constitutions around the world in one form or the other, right? So the right to life, the right to a dignified life, now all of them, for the actualization of the right to clean water is part of it. The right to clean breathing air is part of it. I feel like that are possible enforcement mechanisms before the Human Rights Council that or other human rights bodies that we could look at. And another thing that comes to my mind on top of my head is the fact that there are particular conventions for vulnerable people, for women, for children, for disabled people. And so like enforcement mechanisms under those those, most of them are focused on ensuring that the right to life and the right to dignity is protected of those people. So that could also be a possible avenue, provided that the vulnerable population, which they are in all the countries where the attacks are happening,
Hmm.
women and children apparently are the worst affected in these conflicts, right?
Absolutely.
So we have an infrastructure at place. The last thing is that even if there's a mechanism, even if we take a country before it, who is going to enforce a ruling of a court or a commission or a tribunal? And that is where we've seen international law significantly lacking, right? And I feel like that is the existential crisis that international lawyers are also going through, right? And what you've spoken about is the fact that what is it at the end of the day? What's is it worth it or not? But I still think it is, because I still feel that the fight is worth it, because in the end you are also building a narrative, and but at the same time you're also at least documenting the abuse. Just because someone's not doing anything about it, the documentation and the correct historical narrative building is also equally important.
Absolutely, and something that I've argued is international law gives you the language of critique, right? It gives you the language of saying that this is a violation, that the international community has come together and said that these particular acts are wrong, even if you commit them, and if there isn't an enforcement mechanism. The fact that we can criticize you because of this, that I think has its own value there. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
Mom, I wanted to get your views on the concept of ecocide as, say, a war crime. Do you think that that would be a better way of, say, perhaps holding states accountable? And we all know, the many myriad problems with the International Criminal Court and being able to enforce its warrants. They're currently out on the Israeli Prime Minister and a number of others across the globe, but and they're not being enforced. But do you think by having like a formal offense within the Rome Statute, that this would enhance accountability?
As much as an international lawyer, I would want that, and as much as all of us would want that, I feel like the Rome Statute, with regards to accountability, is already on like a slippery slope, right? And I find international criminal law quite interesting in that way, in the sense that it is less ratified by states than, say, other like mundane random conventions are. And there's a particular reason for that. The reason is that states do not want, even if a state hasn't done anything wrong right now,
Yeah.
it just shows the geopolitics that we're living in. They want to they don't want to be held accountable if they are sup- forced to do something in the future, right? So the Rome Statute, I feel like, started off as an aspirational document. It has done some good with regards to enforcement of international criminal law, but I feel like that the four crimes under the statute right now, we can hardly like prosecute them effectively,
Yeah.
right? And the momentum, I don't think we can, in the current standpoint, number one, we will ever find the momentum to actually go through the process of having ecocide becoming part of the Rome Statute. Like, even countries that were very actively part of the negotiating process of the Rome Statute, in the end never signed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't see, we can hardly like agree to the NDCs in the Paris Agreement, like going for criminal liability for environmental damage. I feel like criminal liability for environmental damage is not even something that would be entertained by most states. And secondly, as much as the ICC it was endeavored to do good, the ICC hasn't really done a lot of favors for the global South countries, right? So the global North, global South countries, the ICC is touted as an example of the divide that happens with the selective enforcement of international law. And honestly, Wes, I feel like it's going to be more of the same. Uh, no one is going to take the United States to, okay, the ICC may initiate an investigation, the prosecutor may do some things and then get sanctioned and then get the visas revoked and like the entire package that comes with it. But I think the people who are going to end up being the recipients of or becoming the target of these of a possible ecocide crime are going to be those in the global south, and God knows there are enough problems to deal with already, right? But the high carbon lifestyles are not coming from the global south, right? They're
Agreed.
coming from the global north, right? They're not, most of them who have also not signed on to the Rome Statute. So as much as like aspirationally, yes, ecocide, I do agree with the understanding that if there is no clean environment, water, air, there will be no future for mankind. But I feel like but criminal liability and ecocide is we're far reach from that
Mm.
right now, because, and I also feel like it's just going to become a tool for the global north to clamp down further on the global south. So yeah.
No, absolutely. I understand your point on this. And I think the last 2 years or 3 years really have been quite disappointing in terms of, you know, clarifying for the whole world the limitations of international justice, if you will,
Yeah.
and the limitations of, say, the International Criminal Court, its warrants and its mechanisms for enforcement there. And you know, we keep on harping on about, all these problems with enforcement, this and that, but is there any way of actually enforcing when you're talking about sovereign states like this? Because it's in the end, it's a voluntary submission of sovereignty,
Yeah.
which you're talking about.
I think, Wes, I'm not going to be very bleak about it, because I do
Mhm.
feel like the enforcement aspect is there, right? Because the idea is that in situations of ICJ cases, we have seen enforcement. We have seen issues of enforcement being escalated to the UN Security Council, and and then if it's against one of the P5 states, there's always the option of a veto. But the idea is the option that, like, the fact that the pathway to enforcement exists in itself. Like when we talk about international law, we talk about the procedural effects and the substantive law,
Yeah.
and how the procedural is supposed to support the substantive law, and procedural justice is equally important. So the enforcement and the escalation ladder is there. Do I feel like the enforcement is there? I feel like there is room for enforcement, and some countries do, who are responsible international countries, do sign on to conventions and do enforce them in good faith and are okay with compliance. I do like WTO enforcement is, until the appeals chamber was completely crippled by the US.
Yeah.
Before that, it was like pretty decent, right? Like it did some substantial good work. So I did give, I feel like international law, the most important thing is giving states a platform to come and air their grievances instead of just getting at each other, which, as we've seen in the current conflict, is just going to have a ripple effect on the entire region, right? So the
Absolutely.
provision of that platform is very important. I feel like states, there are responsible states, and I feel like clumping all states together would not be the best idea. What I do find right now in enforcement, and generally from a global governance perspective, is the fact that regional enforcement has kind of like become a more a more I would say accepted tool. Countries are more willing to like coordinate and cooperate regionally than they are internationally. A lot of that comes from also distrust in the international legal system, considering that a lot of like again global south countries say that it's very like the ideas are very western dominated, and the idea was that they never had a role to play in the making and creation of international law in the 1940s when
Exactly.
the
But
UN was
but they
created, right?
find themselves to be bound by all these obligations now.
They find themselves
Yeah.
to be bound by it. So I feel like the move towards regionalism is quite real, and we're going to see more of that. China, we're going to see playing a bigger role in Asian regionalism as well, right? But when it gets to enforcement, I feel like there is enforcement, because the only thing is that state responsibility is one thing. Because when we talk about, when you said that international law gives you a tool of critique, and I absolutely agree with that, because what international law does also gives states the opportunity to be seen as responsible countries, right? As a
That's
country
very
that
true.
upholds human rights. And I feel like if that is drilled in deeper, that could actually like push states to become more responsible themselves, to accept enforcement in the hope of a larger good, right? Because
Mhm.
the idea is also with resources, we're talking about this thing called a global commons, like, and the common heritage of mankind, where everyone needs to share. And the voluntary buy-in into that system means that you don't violate anyone's rights, so that tomorrow no one violates yours as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more with that. Um, Coming back to the conflict, sadly, in the Middle East, we've seen some, you know, um, a lot of taboos being violated, and one I think in particular is nuclear facilities being targeted. Right? We have this taboo in international humanitarian law where you do not target objects that can release dangerous, can have dangerous effects and can release dangerous objects into the environment or elsewhere. And nuclear facilities, because of the radiation damage, are certainly one of these. We've seen, the U.S. Attack Fordo in the previous encounter that they had. Now we've seen the nuclear facility in Natanz, Iran, be attacked. Bushehr, which is very strategically located because it's on the Persian Gulf. The potential for radiation is not only the water and the the water that touches it, but also the countries on the other side of the bank of the Persian Gulf. So we have a number of Kuwait, Bahrain, and these countries who could be susceptible to radiation
Yeah.
harm. Attacking, what does international law say really about this, and how firm is this taboo? Where do we see this developing? And in response, we saw Iran attacking the Dimona nuclear facility in Israel, right, which is a nuclear weapons facility as far as the world is concerned.
They
How
call
is
it a
this?
research facility.
Sorry,
They call it a research
of
facility, but
course,
like,
research, right?
so I think so that's actually a very interesting question, because this has become one of the major issues in the conflict, right? On the escalation ladder is where do
Yeah.
you draw the line? And I think international law is actually pretty clear on drawing the line at things that cause like dangerous
Substances
spillover,
to.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So international law also treats nuclear facilities very different from ordinary targets because of the catastrophic risks involved in it. The governing law on that is Article 56 of the Additional Protocol, which provides special protection to nuclear and electrical generating stations, and the law is very explicit on it. So it states that these facilities cannot be the object of an attack even where there are a military objective. There's a slight exception to that, which I'm going to come to, but because the attack can release dangerous forces, radiation being a major dangerous force, and can lead to severe losses in the civilian population. And when we
Yeah.
talk about losses to the civilian population, we automatically add in the losses to the environment, which are eventually also going to lead to losses to civilian population.
Yeah.
And for international law, which is generally not very hard on things, like this is a strikingly strong rule. So this means that even if a facility could have argued to have a military value, like Natanz or Bushehr, an attack is still prohibited if there is a real risk of radioactive release and civilian harm.
Mhm.
The only narrow exception is, and it is very, very narrow, is that this protection by the Geneva Convention can cease only if the facility is providing regular and significant direct support to the military operations. And even then, only if attacking that particular facility is the only way you can stop that support, right? I feel like the level of narrowness in that is such that I, the facts are still coming to the ground, but I do feel that it's going to be very hard to justify this attack under this particularly narrow exception.
Yeah.
And particularly also hypothetically considering that the protection is lost, right? The general rules of international law and humanitarian law, like proportionality, precautions to ensure that it isn't like causing harm or releasing dangerous forces, environmental protection, are still going to apply, right?
Of
So
course.
it can't be like a blanket missile strikes you, even if that very narrow exception is taken away. Also, if we talk about, I think the second part of your question was whether this could be justified in international law. I think from both sides, the general rule is no. Uh, US and Israel can't do that to facilities in Iran from the get go, and even as a retaliatory attack, Iran, like, generally the rules of engagement remain the same. You cannot attack a facility that is going to lead to dangerous radiation being put out in the world. The only thing that I feel like Iran could possibly argue in one way, that the Geneva Convention uses the phrase nuclear electrical generating stations, and I think they've classified the Dimona, from what I've read on literature, is the fact that they've classified it as a nuclear research center and a sensitive nuclear site, but not a electrical generating system,
Mhm.
unlike the facilities in Bushehr, which were electrical generating systems. So that exception, if you do a literal interpretation of the law, still remains. But summing up, the first attack or the retaliatory attack is not like justified under international law, and if the strike was directed at to or dangerously close to a nuclear facility in a way that foreseeable risk of the release of dangerous forces could happen, which it could, I feel like in both situations, that weighs strongly in the favor of unlawfulness internationally. Yep.
No, absolutely, ma'am. And I think, one of the critical aspects is understanding, what the liability would be and of course, when it comes to international law and warfare, it's a different ballgame. But we do know what the liability regime is in civilian nuclear power plants, and say there's a meltdown like we had Chernobyl or things like that. And radiation doesn't respect boundaries. It can go across and right there. So there are billions of dollars in funds that are dedicated for this particular thing, whether it's Europe or in other countries. And this third party liability where, Kuwait or Bahrain, who is not necessarily directly involved in these conflicts, they would suffer damages and would be able to get some form of compensation. But because Iran is so isolated, it is not party to these third party liability insurance schemes, if you will. So this becomes another very serious issue that needs to be looked at. Um, Another aspect, Mohammed, I wanted to get your views on this, was the attacks on desalination plants, right? I think the first attacks were again by U.S. and Israeli forces on a desalination plant in Iran, which took out the ability for a number of villages to receive clean drinking water. And then we saw in retaliation, a desalination plant, and I forget whether it was Bahrain or Kuwait, but in one of these countries that was damaged by an Iranian drone. And of course,
Yeah.
these are low-hanging fruit. These are very easy to target. These are, soft targets in this warfare, really. But the impact is significant. The humanitarian aspects that could come out, because these are countries that have very limited water resources available to them. We've also seen that everybody's been saying the future of wars is going to be on basic resources like fresh water and whatnot. Mom, could you give us a better idea on trying to understand how water can be weaponized really, and what international law says really here?
So I think water weaponization is something that, for personally, for someone who's really interested in water and transboundary waters and the human right to water, I feel like internationally we're not taking it up as the issue that needs to be taken up, because it does, because water is no longer used as a resource in conflict now, and it has become a weapon, and we've seen that around the world, right? And this this particular conflict has just magnified the need to
Yeah.
look at it more closely, right? So, and we see water weaponization happen in two main ways in this conflict. Firstly, which is directly through threats and attacks on desalination plants and water infrastructure. And in parts of the Middle East, these facilities don't have like a supplementary role, like a backup role, right? They are the primary source of drinking water.
Yeah.
So targeting them immediately puts civilian populations at risk. And secondly, there's an indirect impact as well, because by targeting the systems that ensure the provision of water, there is going to be a direct impact on the provision of electricity and fuel. So attacks on power plants, grids, and energy infrastructure can shut down water access without ever striking a water facility itself as well. So we spoke about like the energy infrastructure, and water becomes part of that. So the ripple effects are felt on multiple human rights issues, right? From an international law perspective, this is something that I feel like needs to become the center of international legal conversations, because water infrastructure falls within what the law calls there's like this phrase we use, that objects indispensable to the survival of the human population, right? And that means it's afforded heightened protections under international law. What that means is that parties to a conflict are prohibited from attacking, destroying, or rendering useless any object when the effect is to deny the civilian population from essential water that they need to survive for, and the right to water for drinking and sanitation is now a recognized human right. So when we talk about water weaponization, what is really happening in legal terms is that civilian dependence on water is being used as a strategic leverage, which is to pressurize governments, destabilize economies, and impose like wider hardships as a means, as a bargaining chip, right? And I feel like when you add the concept of the human right to water on it, which is recognized also by international human rights law, I think in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and they
Yeah.
have a comment number 15 on the right to water, right? So I feel like this right does not disappear during armed conflict, and that needs to be very, very clearly put out there, that the right to water is something that is so fundamental to the right to life and the right to dignity that armed conflict does not impact the provision and the actualization of this right. What that means from a conflict perspective and for states in Iran and the Middle East and the United States is that they all remain under an obligation to protect this right, and they have to refrain from actions that interfere with the access to water, which includes like destruction of infrastructure or desalination plants, or even contamination of water sources that we've seen in the Middle East in previous conflicts. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't want to single out any country, but because no one is here with completely clean hands. Everyone is on all sides. But Israel in particular, we've seen it use tactics like this, whether it's attacking water infrastructure, whether it is using starvation as a weapon of war, to
Yeah.
take evacuate areas, right? To force the civilian population, make the conditions of life so difficult that they have to move from that place. We're now currently seeing it in south of Lebanon, right? Where
Yeah.
up to the Litani River, they've taken out the bridges, they've taken out those things. So this becomes, I think, a fundamentally humanitarian. The nature of this becomes, a violation of humanitarian precepts that are, enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, but also generally in customary international law. And that warfare isn't supposed to be fought like this. There are alternatives to fighting, right? One of the arguments we saw after, October 7th was that how else is Israel supposed to fight these terrorists? They hide behind civilians, this and that. There were many other ways of doing that, right? And warfare has again and again, we've seen countries fight wars by abiding more or less with the rules of war. So it's not impossible to not target a desalination plant, right?
It's absolutely not, by the way. Also, Wes, we were just talking about it. We're living in a time of artificial intelligence and cyber war, right?
Yeah.
So you really don't even need to physically like target in like a combat or military way, right? There have been situations where like dams have they've shut down dams through a cyber attack as well. And that would not require that wouldn't involve like literally bombing a place and like annihilating everything on the sides. So cyber war and water is also a completely is a very big domain that needs to be looked at. At the same time, it's also very dangerous because like you could open a dam and flood the lower community and stuff like that. So which is
Absolutely.
another conversation. But I feel like I don't know whether I feel like that or like whenever I read anything on the news, I feel like that the proportionality test has like gone out of the window. There is no thing
Completely.
even when we're talking about starvation as a method of like kind of getting people to move. That's kind of like ethnic cleansing, right? That was one of the ways that ethnic cleansing and genocide used to happen, right? You just like stop food, stop water, like people are eventually going to die, right? I again I feel like I feel like enough conversations by like the really big international lawyers who get to litigate regularly before international courts and tribunals don't talk about the fact that the idea of proportionality has completely like been done away with, which is which when we talk about the Geneva Conventions and we talk about international humanitarian law, but also when we talk about any other law, right? We talk about environmental law, water law, like even trade law. Proportionality is key and center of international law, reprisals, enforcement. Like, so I would take a far shot and say, oh, Israel violated international law, so we can clump all of this as countermeasures, right?
Mhm.
the like that's one of the also the arguments they're saying is that we're literally allowed to do anything under the sun because it's a countermeasure. But
They
that's
play
not
dirty, so
true.
we play dirty, and yeah.
Yeah, but that's also not true. Yeah, countermeasures are allowed under the international law for wrongful state acts, but also the ICJ has put down like very strict rules on countermeasures. They need to be limited in time. They need to be targeted to
Mhm.
correcting the issue that is at hand. It's not like, oh, they're making a nuclear power plant, let's wipe out the population. That is not targeting the issue at hand.
Right.
Also, they need to be time bound, and they cannot be of a perpetual nature. You can't just like a countermeasure cannot be like for the next 100 years we're going to starve a population, right? So I feel like every time someone comes on screen and say, oh, we're doing this as a countermeasure, that's absolutely incorrect. A countermeasure would be like shutting off airspace for 30 days, right? It doesn't mean like going like taking the Rome Statute, reading everything there is in it, and then just like saying like let's violate all of this as a countermeasure, and then let's see where like if that gets us kind of a thing,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, war crimes are not countermeasures, right?
No, absolutely not. Countermeasures are just like so. The I feel like the states are very loose in just throwing around the term that we're doing that.
Yeah.
But the only acceptable countermeasures that the ICJ has said, like, oh yeah, you could do that, is like shutting off airspace, maybe, or economic sanctions. That also when they do not impact the human right to development, the right to
Mm.
sustenance, the right to food, and like multiple other rights is when economic sanctions are okay. So let's not even talk about what's happened in Venezuela, right, with like the sanctions regime. And so the idea is like countermeasures are not like you bomb the country out of existence. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Well, I mean, at times I look at the international regime and I say, have we overcomplicated these rules? States aren't following them as they are, and we're talking about, developing further rules on limiting how states can use that. I mean, IHL, I think, is one of the most permissive regimes where, because of the doctrine of military necessity, you can, you're authorized, well, or not authorized, but it tolerates the loss of civilian collateral life, right? Loss of civilian collateral damage that can take place. So we've seen that there, and despite all of this, despite these, this permissive nature of IHL, it's still being considered, at least through the actions, as being too restrictive of these things. Because is the world going towards this total war concept, or this concept where there are no rules that are going to be limiting us in any real way?
Firstly, I hope not, because I feel like the 1940s was a time when really like international law was revamped in a way to ensure that what had happened in World War One, World War Two did not happen again, right? And just the fact that we could go towards that kind of anarchy is just it is something very very troubling. But at the same time, I completely agree with you. I feel like the international law structure that was built was kind of built on a compromise, right?
Yeah.
The provisions in our international humanitarian law are a very good example of the fact that okay, you can do things as a military necessity or a national security exception, as a lot of constitutions call it, but to protect the sovereignty of a country. The veto power was the same, right? All of these little compromises were put in place so that the fabric of international law that was created was one that was woven strongly enough that people could slip through it if required, but had to abide by certain rules if they wanted to do that. And that was the intention behind giving these compromises. The fact that, oh, if we do give compromises, it will give states the leeway to exercise their own sovereignty while staying within a broader humanitarian human rights framework, so that we don't see the hardship and the loss of millions of lives that had happened prior to the current, like, which we say, like, the post UN framework of
Yeah.
international law. I do I think that it's completely breaking away? I wouldn't say, OS, it's completely breaking away, because at the same time we're also seeing like rapidly new laws developing within that framework, right? We see laws for telecommunication, we see laws for AI, we see laws for the environment, which also people are like in and out of, like, and we see larger conversations about newer issues that are emerging, which is equally important. But at the same times, we do see a step back from the traditional rules that were made. But at the same time, I do feel like international law has still, I don't think it's a complete failure, because I again, as you said, it has at least listed down what is allowed and what is not allowed. So at least countries and individuals and other non-state actors have the language to say what is legal and not legal, right?
Yeah.
Right now no one is saying that, thankfully, that genocide is legal, right? If we say that if we do away with international law, there have to be categorized, there are situations that have to be categorized as different levels of illegality. And I feel like thankfully no one's like started like, oh, let's make this unlawful thing lawful now. No one's
Mhm.
saying that this is lawful. They're just saying we're not, like, we are doing something unlawful, and that's what it is. I feel like that recognition of unlawfulness is still there, and I'm hoping that that recognition is eventually going to push states to act, because if you take out international law, then what is lawful and what is unlawful, right?
Absolutely.
So,
And
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 that
we
would be the worst situation to be in.
Absolutely. And Mama, when people say, international law has failed, what alternative do we have? There is
Yeah.
none, right? And it's true that at times international law fails as a dispute resolution mechanism or framework, but it is the last best hope that we have. So, Maham, on that note, I know you have a busy schedule ahead of you. Again, thank you so much for taking out the time for speaking to me.
You're welcome, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maham. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for this week.